was looking for it. It's not here. There are Supreme Court justices, but it's certainly true, as we just heard in a very articulate presentation, that Thurgood Marshall led the NAACP legislation against segregated schools. And it's a fact, as we just heard, that civil rights activism and litigation in the 50s and 60s that culminated in the '64 Civil Rights Act and a set of other legislation had a profound effect on elevating the status of blacks and many other Americans. There was a spillover effect as well. So Brown, as we heard about, social activism, the Voting Rights Act, I think caused substantial progress for all Americans. And I think that's important to remember as well. Blacks, women, Hispanics, gays, Jews, and other groups that had somehow were treated in ways that were no longer permitted to be treated after the surge of civil rights activism. And we know from the writings of the period that desegregating schools was seen as a means to a larger end of promoting inclusion and creating opportunity for all Americans. We know, for example, that the Civil Rights Act and the legislation around that and the litigation and enforcement and the civil rights activism, it wasn't just the law, but it was a set of forces set in motion, definitely caused an increase in the economic progress of African Americans, which was especially pronounced in the previously segregated South. So just to remind you of some episodes, this takes you only to a period up to about 1990, but this is when the great surge occurred. If we look at the ratio of non-white to white total money income, taking us from 1954, around the time of Brown, and to 1989, we see an increase. We also see that the ratio is by no means equal to 1, but we do see a substantial increase. But what was noted, and what I think was very important in understanding this increase, is it went across different regions. So the Northeast, the region we're in now, the Midwest, my region. If we look, for example, at the Western region, we see that there isn't much of a trend. Where the trend really occurred was exactly in the Southern region, where the discrimination was actually the greatest, and where in some real sense the laws were targeted, and as we saw, the violence and this discriminatory system was quite great. One statistic that I would also show is just the dramatic increase. This is a study that I did some years ago now, looking at employment of African Americans and whites and blacks in the South Carolina textile industry. It was particularly interesting that because of the Jim Crow law passed in that state in the early part of the 20th century, that in fact the records were actually kept by race until it became illegal to do so in the 1970s. And you can see that through various labor markets, the textile industry was basically completely segregated. If you look at the bottom lines here, you're going to see black males and black females were basically not represented until around 1960s when you saw a dramatic breakthrough. And we can see this in many other indicators. So there's no question that these dramatic breakthroughs were real and they were focused on the South. I would point out though, and I have Bob Margo here in the room to keep me honest on these points, that these dramatic breakthroughs in earnings and occupations, which really did, I think, carry over to the larger society in the sense of making the discrimination and unequal treatment of individuals across all categories really became impermissible in American society. This percolated out across the whole society. But it's important to note that this was not primarily caused by increases in schooling or schooling quality. It was too gradual, those increases in schooling quality. And as has been noted by many scholars, even in anticipation of Brown, many Southern school districts were actually starting to improve the quality of their schools, even though they weren't great in 1954. So, for example, work by David Card and Alan Kruger estimates that at most about, it's a substantial component, 15 to 20% of this increase in African American income that I showed was due to increasing schooling quality. But a lot of it had to do with removal of discriminatory barriers. And so the simple phrase was the South fought the law, the citizens' councils rose up and were created in the wake of the Brown decision, but the law eventually won, and it was a great triumph for the law. So the success of the civil rights movement in the 60s gave rise to the hope that if we reverse the state-sanctioned discrimination, that active government intervention in the economy, the schools, and the courts would produce full equality for blacks in the larger society. And yet, as we've just seen in these statistics that Professor Ogletree put up, and is evident in many social statistics, that even though there's real success, many African Americans are successful in a variety of fields, the economic and social progress of a large segment of black Americans is stagnating. So the question is, why did the hopes of the civil rights movement not be realized? What can we learn from the stalled progress? And then, for the topic of this conference, what is the likely effectiveness of litigation and civil rights legislation today? And what is the comparative effectiveness of various strategies? And to be frank, and maybe to sound potentially dissonant note, I want to say that I think that it's going to be illusory to think that litigation campaigns and civil rights laws alone are going to contribute much to declining difference, spread an era of declining differences between blacks and whites. So a key question for this conference to consider is whether the challenges in making headway in economic and social arenas are distinctive to African Americans, or whether they're consequences of common forces. So there's no question that Black America has a unique history. We just heard about it. And the court cases and the whole history going back hundreds of years suggests a very unique history. Although I would also point out that my former colleague and your colleague across the river, I guess, Bill Wilson, notes in many of his writings that the first order problems facing many African Americans today in contemporary society are shared by many other groups. And I would argue today that a politically and economically effective strategy is to be one that's inclusive and that looks at this question of social inequality. And what is that? Well, I think we know that the main shortfall of all groups, if you look at the rising income inequality, we look at the rising social inequality that's characterizing American society, a large part of this is due to the shortfalls in skills. And here I want to consider not just education, although education is important. I want to consider on-the-job training, workforce experience that comes with having a job and a good job and learning, but also traits like cognitive traits and personality traits. So it's important to recognize that many skills are required for success in life, and more than education is required. Although education is an important role, plays an important role, in the modern society, many skills are very important. So we have to think very globally about, and very much more broadly than just education. So what do we know about the economy? Global economic forces have challenged unskilled persons of all races and ethnicities. There are secular trends in trade and technology that have boosted the demand for skilled labor. And yet, in a very interesting and very troubling phenomenon, is that across the board, not just in the African American community, but in the Hispanic community, and in large sections of the white community, the supply of skills has responded very, very slowly. So we have a society that's become very polarized. We have one group at the top, for example. The percentage of Americans with college degrees is the highest in our history, no question about it. And yet the high school dropout rate in the American society, properly counted, has actually increased for all ethnic groups, including not just African American males, but also among whites, Hispanics, and even when you count Hispanics who are not immigrants, Hispanics educated here with families going back generations in the United States, we actually see a decline in the high school graduation rate. So what's happening in the larger society is that we are dividing into affluent haves and underprivileged have-nots. So let me just lay out my argument. The simple argument is I think there are three essential truths that I want to sort of lay out on the table for our discussion. The first, and I think it's very important that we think about it, especially when we evaluate the success or failure of schools, is that public policy to promote skills should reckon with, first, that more than cognition and intelligence, more than what's measured in No Child Left Behind test, more than what's measured in an achievement test is required for success in life. Character and personality skills, social skills, sometimes they're called soft skills, matter a great deal. We've come to understand, and that's the psychology part of my work, but it's linked a lot with the economics, things like conscientiousness, perseverance, sociability, and other character traits matter a great deal, while they're generally ignored. So that's the first point. I want to amplify that point. The second point is that skill formation is a dynamic, synergistic process. I think this is something we've learned very well in the last 50 years. Skills beget skills, they cross-foster and promote each other. A curious, persevering child learns more and has a huge advantage in life. Advantages accumulate, and this is something we've come to understand. Young children are flexible and adaptable in a way that adolescents are not, and adults are even less flexible. And so preventing deficits, we understand now, is much more important than we even knew them to be important 20 years ago. Third, and this is a very important point, families play an essential role in shaping the abilities and the opportunities for children. It's the family, not just the school system, that plants and nourishes the seed that grows into successful students and adults. So skill formation is starting in the womb, and in fact, substantial gaps in abilities between the advantage and the disadvantage across all race groups, across all ethnic groups, are basically present before children enter school. I want to show you a very staggering figure in a minute. So what we've actually found is that American schools, they contribute a bit to widening and narrowing the gaps. But in fact, when we look at the raw data, a lot of the gaps in test scores, a lot of the gap in the achievement scores, are there right present when children are entering school, before they even get into the kindergarten. So we need to think this, we need to take into account this kind of knowledge. But we also have to understand that across all racial and ethnic groups, and this is something that usually is not joined in this discussion, but across all ethnic groups, across all America, and this is well documented, and in fact, and this is not just an American phenomenon, that the American family in particular is under strain, and families are under strain. So we now know, we saw this recently in a figure that was put out by the New York Times, and it's been much discussed, that basically we see that close to 40% of all American children are born in families, are born out of wedlock. All across the board. This is not just a white difference, this is now American society. More than 12% of families, 12% of all children are living in families where the mother has never been married. I'll show you that such families have very much fewer financial and parenting resources for child development. So I think it's very well documented from many studies by sociologists, by economists, anthropologists, ethnographic studies, and very hardcore studies by developmental psychologists, that these parents, these families are putting their children at great development risk. And so I've come to the second point, which is that an effective policy to foster skills has to come to terms with another phenomenon in American society: the importance of the family, the mechanisms through which families create child skills, and the stress under which families operate. So this gets me into what could be potentially a flashpoint, and I'll do it maybe at my risk, but I'll say it anyway. Partly because Bill Wilson has pioneered this discussion, I will just draw on his analysis. So everybody knows the famous, or some people would say infamous, Moynihan report, written some 50 years ago, when he pointed out at that time that 26% of all African American children were born out of wedlock. That was, again, targeting African Americans in 1965. I mentioned just a minute ago 40% of all children, whether or not they're white or black or whatever, are born out of wedlock. Now his report met with a very venomous reception, and I think correctly it's said now that he was falsely charged with blaming the victim. So for many years, to discuss the family as a contributor to black disparity was considered incorrect. Now Bill Wilson has pointed out that in fact this is a general problem, and others have pointed out. So this is something that's rooted deeply in the social science, the psychology, that we really have to come to grips with certain environments being less beneficial for children. And it's not just a black-white thing. Moynihan's insensitive and sometimes incendiary language obscured something that's very important. His insights apply generally. Dysfunctional families are basically contributing to problems across the whole social spectrum. When we think about the problem of inequality, we cannot ignore the issues about families. And the strategy I want to talk about today will essentially advocate policies to supplement families, to recognize the reality of family life, and to recognize the risks in which children are born into, and how we can actually think about bolstering the lives of those children.